I'm particularly excited about this topic because I think Ray, as we had a chance to speak about it, earlier in the week, but we are seeing many organizations, even though we're still very much in the COVID pandemic, in certain industries, adding a number of sales positions. And, it's really, when you look at sales positions, it's hiring's not an exact science. Sometimes we think we have the exact right person and it doesn't pan out. Other times we weren't quite as sure and it does work. But there are a number of things we can do to really increase our success rates here. So that's what we want to talk about today is really how to build a world-class sales organization, how to really focus in on getting the right candidates, what you should be looking for, maybe some red flags along the way. And also, from a coaching standpoint, once you've made that hard decision, how do we really make sure they're successful? So I'm excited. We're going to get started in a poll with just a minute, but let me turn it over to Ray first if you have any intro comments.
No, this is a great topic and one we're excited to talk about because I think it is so timely and relevant, Norman. And also it's one our clients are really trying to get their arms around. What does that look like for this year? How is it different? And how do we get it right? Because it's so important. And I would say, to your point, whether you're hiring one person this year or 100, the focus and investment you're making in hiring the right person and getting them on board and bringing them up to speed successfully, it has a huge ROI and also can be really costly if you don't get it right. And we've probably all seen the calculations on the cost of a bad hire, but it's not just the recruiting and onboarding, it's also the cost of having that territory sit underutilized or unfulfilled for a year or longer until you find out that you have the wrong person in there. That can actually be many, many times the actual cost of the salary or the cost of the hire. So I think the stakes are high here and excited to jump into it.
Terrific. Well, Ray, let's open up with a quick poll, and as people are kind of working their way through the poll, we can share our agenda. So we did want to kind of just gauge our participants today, just kind of really understand, what you're thinking about for your sales team in 2021. And while you're doing that, let's just talk a little bit about today's agenda, which includes, really defining the essential salesperson attributes for long-term success. So we want to talk about what are those attributes you look for. We'll go into a little bit more depth. What do we mean by attributes? Something we'd all like to do better is what is it that makes our top performers so successful? How do we replicate that when we hire others? How do we make more informed and hiring decisions? And then we'll go into a little bit about coaching, really to maximize your sales team's performance. So we're going to begin on those topics in just a minute. But Ray, as you talk to clients out there, what are you hearing just anecdotally about, additional headcount in sales for 2021?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I think it's very industry dependent, depending on the impact of the sales teams and access. But I think we're seeing, pretty positive signs in terms of people planning for headcount growth. They may, in some cases, be scaling back up where they had people on furlough, or maybe they did some downsizing, but they're now ramping back up, and in fact are planning to hire. So yeah, I think we are definitely seeing that. As I'm looking, and I'll share the results of our poll here, it's interesting that a large percentage of our audience today says they're looking at moderate growth. 58% of the audience says they're planning for moderate growth this year, 16% for significant growth. So if I look at that, that's 3/4 of our audience is looking at some growth this year, and maybe a quarter no increase, and nobody's planning to downsize. And I think this ends up being very kind of quarter to quarter, and we'll see how the year plans out. But we're planning to grow this year, so we better make sure we're doing it right.
I think that's exactly right. Now, I guess what's really encouraging to me is the fact that, almost a year ago when the pandemic started to hit, we saw huge reductions in sales positions, and no one is projecting any reduction. So we're seeing, as you said, 2/3 of the audience looking to grow their teams. And I want to just kind of share with you some of our thoughts around hiring the right people. So with that, let's get into our agenda. And we have another question we want to run by you. And so we're going to bring up a chat, and as Alonzo said, we'll keep it really interactive. But we use the term attributes. We're going to define that in a few minutes. But before we get into our definition, we'd like to just kind of understand what attributes have you found to be most successful in your sales organization. So I'm going to again bring up a chat if we could. and just kind of understand what attributes have you found to be most successful in your sales organization?
Yeah, this will be really interesting to hear, Norman. Kind of not presupposing, but when we think about starting with the end in mind, right? To give credit to Stephen Covey, but what does the successful hire look like? And I'm not talking here about education or even specific experience, but what attributes? What do you really want from that top sales professional? I see some of the responses coming in now. So Adi mentions flexibility. I think that's so critical. We need people that can think on their feet. They can respond. We want that ability to pivot. Julio mentions self-motivated, work ethic, having a solution focus, so being that consultative mindset. Um, Alex mentions curiosity. That's always on my list, but somebody who's truly and genuinely curious about the individual and about the business, as well as some financial savvy and acumen. We have other Stefan mentions attitude and focus. So some really great attributes and thoughts coming in. Norman, what are your
I think
observations?
I saw drive. I see adaptability. I see someone's forward thinking, someone who's coachable. So on people are goal oriented. So I want to just kind of get our participants' take on this. And we're seeing many really important attributes. And those are, if we go back to our list of attributes, I think I may have passed over that, Ray. But if we go back a slide, we just look at the list of attributes. We'll share with you some of our ideas, but really like the ones we're getting from our participants. So some organizations, people are competitive, maybe confident, people who show grit. I know that Ray, you've done a lot of blogging about grit based, I think it was on Angela Duckworth's book on
Hmm.
grit.
Hmm.
Integrity, very important. I think even, now that the pandemic has hit, people are really looking for people who, not only with high integrity, people who can show empathy, people have really good judgment, people are motivated. A lot of people are working from home, so motivation and work ethic are really important, planning an organization. And so what we've found historically is that two or three, maybe four of these are going to be most important. It could vary very much by the type of position and the type of organization and the values you have. But these are really things that are important to look for. And unlike skills, so skills might be something like communication skills or managing objections or developing solutions. The skills are things that are trainable, but generally the personal qualities or these attributes that are here are generally not trainable. These are things that by the time we're really hiring an adult audience, most of these are pretty much baked into our DNA. So it's really important if these are, if you zero in on three or four of these that make the most impact in your organization, that you try and discover these during the hiring process. So Ray, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because I think our group ticked off most of these and
For
more.
sure.
And I think everybody has their idea or their vision for an ideal rep. And we're going to transition and talk about building a profile, but I think what's most important is it does differ by the position, the organization, by the sales team. And even though it'd be great to get all of these, I took my boys through scouts, and you had to learn the 12 points and be able to memorize that. Well, how do you interview for all 12? And the answer is we probably can't have everything, or at least it's really hard to assess that. So I think it's really important to kind of drill into, which of those are most important for you in this position, and make sure everybody's on the same page, because there's nothing more frustrating than you get three managers interview somebody and somebody says, well, I don't think they were very resilient, and the other person says, well, I don't think they had work ethic or integrity. And it's like, well, how do you make that decision when everybody's got a different idea of kind of what's most important?
Right. And I think one of the key things is because people may define these differently is really being organized in the type of questions that we ask to really discover these attributes. Also, I love what Dennis put up on persistence. We're going to build that on a list. I think persistence is another great quality. So, let's think about what really makes our people top performers within our current organization, and how do we go out and find people who have some of those same attributes. So Ray, why don't you kind of take us through this idea of a star profile? Because I think what I like about the profile is it's different than a job description. So the job description is very much candidate facing. So what is that person who's interviewing for the position going to what's that job look like for them? What will their responsibilities be? The job profile is really for the company and specifically for the hiring manager, particularly the sales manager. What am I looking for? And I think, a lot of organizations unfortunately hire off a job description, and just taking the few extra minutes it takes to create a profile really allows you to zero in on more of the attributes and the skills you'd be looking for. So Ray, let me turn it back to you on that topic.
Yeah, well, I think that's really the first step is we want to build that profile. We want to think about what the top performers are doing. And it really defines that successful salesperson, again, within your context, within your organization. You can't just pull something off LinkedIn, right, or off Monster and say, all right, here's our job description. That may work for the initial screen, but you want to really think about what's going to make that person flourish. And I will say it's looking at the top performers. So it's not just looking at the Michael Jordans or the Wayne Gretzky's of the world and then trying to replicate that, because chances are that that's a unicorn and that may be very difficult. But in general, if you look back at the top performers, what attributes did they have? How can you tailor that right to your situation and then build those skills, those attributes, the competencies you're looking for to address it appropriately? And so I think we really do want to look at that, kind of top performer analysis, think about what they've been doing, and then use that as a benchmark through the recruiting and selecting process. That's actually going to drive our decision matrix that we're going to get to. But knowing what that scorecard is, if you will, that we're going to be using. So I'll say, as much as we'd love to make a formula out of this or define it and automate it, there's still a lot of nuance and a lot of social science to just understanding that person and the fit. So I think this gives us a great guide point and guidepost, but it's not a magic formula or something you can just turn into an automated widget. So let's look at what the STAR profile, how that really builds out. We often talk about education and work experience, things that we would typically see on a job posting. You have to have X amount of years in the role or selling experience, certain education. But job performance, I think, is critical. And looking for those things like, if it's an experienced salesperson, have they been in President's Club? Have they made President's Club? Have they been a top performer? Did they exceed quota? And my experience, we just screened about 175 candidates for an open role we have. Those that exceed their quota will likely tell you about it. And they will let you know that, hey, I exceeded by 25%, or I ramped up and was the top performing rep. You want those who have that past performance and that past expertise. Obviously, we're going to look at other things, but then you can get into the skills and knowledge they have about the industry, about the sales process or the selling skills, and then those more intangible, those qualities and behaviors and attributes that we mentioned. What else are we looking for in those candidates?
And what I'd add to that, Ray, is, think about work experience. Have they had a stable job history? Have they had previous sales experience? Do they have a history, as you mentioned, of success? In terms of job performance, making sure they really had direct responsibility. It could be they were with a really successful organization where, all the salespeople were successful. Really try and discover what it was that they did personally, where they were, that they were accountable as, career progression, President's Club, some things Ray mentioned, really important to look for. Skills and knowledge are going to be really important. Selling skills. So what kind of selling skills do they have? What kind of technical skills do they need? Working with a industrial client right now where industry knowledge is really important. And as I mentioned, at the outset, the skills and knowledge, you can decide how much training you want to provide. So if you're looking for someone who's really experienced, who can hit the ground running, you may want people who are very proficient at those skills. If you're building a much longer organization, you have a strong coaching and mentoring program, but keep in mind the skills and knowledge are areas that you can train to. The qualities and behaviors are more intrinsic to the individual. If the person has integrity, they probably have good integrity. They don't have good integrity, it's probably not going to change. It's something you can really train. I'd say the same thing about motivation or work ethic or persistence. So you have kind of the tangibles related to skills and knowledge. And what probably really sets your top people apart more than anything, the intangibles related to their personal qualities and their behaviors.
Yeah, and I really love those profiles that kind of, again, starting with the end in mind, but look ahead and say, the successful candidate for this position will be able to build a pipeline within 90 days or 180 days or whatever that is, or will be able to book meetings with the ideal client profile and be able to do outbound prospecting. So what are those measures? So at the end of 90 days or 180 days, you can look back and say, well, these were the expectations. Let's start that conversation from before day one. So it's not a surprise when we say, well, this really isn't working out, but what is it that we're looking for and what do we need to be successful?
Ray, you just triggered a thought, which is that 90-day mark. And we're seeing in a lot of our clients, job offer letters, the 90-day as kind of being a benchmark for a check-in. And while it may not be enough time to assess results, it certainly is a very reasonable period of time to assess activity levels. So I think this idea of, setting expectations and during the hiring process, maybe we'll help people describe how they onboarded on prior sales roles could be very important. So Ray, we've shared our list, but let's turn it over to our participants again. I'd love to hear, other things that our clients are looking for as they go out and search for new hires.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, if you could use the chat and if you could just use that drop down to say all panelists and participants, that way we'll collaborate amongst the group here. But love to hear your thoughts. What else is important to you assessing new candidates? What's in your profile that you're looking for? And I'll just comment as people are thinking and typing in there. I
Yeah.
saw
I
a
see
comment.
diversity, which is, very important to have, not, we're not trying to clone everyone. We really want to have diversity in the sales organization. Our customer base is diverse and we should have a very diverse sales force.
Yeah,
Emotional
I love.
intelligence, love that.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
Really important right now, particularly, selling remotely, being able to kind of pick up on verbal cues using Zoom. Ray, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. Even, Dennis mentions asking a lot of questions. So I'll share. I just gave a presentation yesterday to our University of Washington sales program to their folks who are going through the sales certificate. And one of the things I talked about was treating the interview like a sales call. And so I expect somebody who's coming in and interviewing to really show me some selling skills. So as Dennis mentioned, the ability to ask questions, are they trying to understand the position before they sell themselves? Or are they just coming in and regurgitating their resume and frankly boring you with all the details? No, they should really think about, well, what's most important to you and how can I do that? So I think asking questions, being curious, demonstrating some of those intangibles during the interview is super important as well. We're
Seeing
also
a really
seeing, customer focus, team player, great listener. That came up a number of times. I think that's a critical skill to look for.
Yeah, I'm seeing one from Doug right above those, ability to understand and solve problems. I think the ability to understand gets to great questioning skills and active listening skills. And ultimately would present a solution. We want to be able to solve a customer problem. So particularly in more complex sales, the ability to understand and problem solve, I think is a great differentiator in terms of having a consultative conversation and adding value to that conversation. So love that point. What else are we seeing here?
Yeah, and again,
Communication
a lot of these
skills.
get to the attributes that we're going to use and probably build and how we look for those, right? Which we're going to talk about, which is how do we actually interview and assess. But I think there are a lot of those that go way beyond. And Audie made a comment earlier about hiring people that don't have sales experience. And
Mhm.
I think that's when those attributes become even more important. We were talking a lot yesterday about grit, as you mentioned, passion and perseverance. So
Mhm.
I'll take somebody with grit over somebody with a pedigree, given other equal factors, because you want that person who's going to day in and day out get up and persevere and do what it takes. So I think you can assess that based on their background and some of the things they've done. And even in Duckworth's research, she looked at salespeople and found that grit was a predictor of success on whether they were going to make quota and whether they were going to be there, year in and year out. So yeah, I think there are a lot of these that we can build into our profile.
Terrific. So let's take a look at the next area, which is really how we make more informed and confident hiring decisions. So what is it that really allows us to feel very confident and really you know, make a decision that we've hired someone we think we have a high degree of confidence they will be successful in our organization.
Yeah,
And
so I think we can build it from the bottom up here, right?
yeah,
And think about the competencies that we're looking for. So, What are those core things that we need the person to do and to be competent? What are the behaviors that are going to indicate that they can do that? So maybe they've demonstrated that in the past, or we've seen evidence of that they can share. And then we really want to build our interview questions to support that, looking for those behaviors and competencies. Because I don't think, frankly, the hypotheticals, well, what would you do in this situation, is as valuable, because a good salesperson is going to think on their feet, or a good interviewer, and you don't know if they're a good salesperson, but they're going to think on their feet. They're going to give you the answer that they think you want to hear, versus really going back to, well, tell me what you did, what were your behaviors, and diving into that specific area that you're looking for. We'll talk more about that in the behavior-based interviewing.
Yeah, one of the things, if you think about a tangible example here, I think motivation came up. So if the competency is motivation, some of those behaviors might be starting early, working late, extra prospecting time, leveraging social media. So it's to just kind of stay at the competency, whether that's work ethic or grit or motivation or planning skills. We want to kind of be able to assess what are those behaviors that tie to the competency. And then, as Ray was mentioning, really using interview questions based on those behaviors. Thus, the title, behavior-based interviewing. And we've got a really nice approach for that. So, Ray, can you take us through kind of our approach to behavior-based interviewing?
Yeah, people may be familiar with the STAR model. It's certainly been around for years. And I think a lot of organizations use something similar to this, or use this model. And that's the idea of, when I think of it, gives the person who's interviewing a framework to use for asking questions. And actually, it gives the person who's being interviewed kind of a storytelling framework that they should respond in that fashion as well, if they're thinking about, you know, what the interviewer is really looking for, and the importance of that question. So it starts with the situation. Hey, can you describe a situation where you accomplished something or used a specific behavior? Julio had one, I think, in the chat that said, tell me about a difficult situation you have. Or for a sales position, I like to go one step further, right? Tell me about a really challenging deal that you were in jeopardy of losing. So that's the situation. Now, tell me what your tasks were. What were you responsible for, related to that role? I don't want to know what the team did or what your boss did. What were your tasks that you were trying to accomplish? And then what actions did you take? So when it got off track, what did you do to get it back? How did you, reevaluate? How did you ask for help? What were those actions that you were involved in? And then ultimately, what was the result? So frankly, I don't care if you won or lost the deal, but what came out of that? What did you learn and take away? And I'd love them to be able to say, hey, and then I applied this in the future, and this is what I learned from it. So now I'm getting down to, what have they actually done? And if they can't come up with any examples, at least I was trying to probe a little further. And if they really don't have that, it says something about that candidate, especially if they've been in sales. If they can't think about a difficult deal, or a time when a competitor was going to beat them, or when they had a difficult client they had to respond to, if they can't come up with any of those, I'd probably question their experience level a little bit further.
And keep in mind, you can really customize the questions to the situation. So if the quality that they're looking for is motivation, you're going to want to have them describe a situation that required motivation. If it was something that required judgment, you want to have them describe a situation that, that where they had to represent, good judgment. So you have the ability, and it's really a best practice to develop some of these questions in advance. If you know those 3 or 4 attributes that are really important to your organization, think through your questions are. But this model has another ancillary benefit to it, and that's that it slows down the interview process. So quite often in an interview, it's easy for the hiring manager, the sales manager, to spend most of the time describing the company, describing the position, describing what they're looking for, and selling the company. And those things are all important, but they end up dominating the interview. By asking these kind of open-ended questions, and as Ray was demonstrating, what's the task, the action, the results, it puts the manager into active listening mode, just like if you were on a sales call with a customer. So it really slows down the process. It gives the candidate that's being interviewed an opportunity to really share, and it gives the manager an opportunity to really listen and see, does this person have the personal qualities that I'm looking for? Because let's face it, most salespeople are pretty good at sales, and they've become very, very good at interviewing. So unless we slow it down, we ask some probing questions, we're really not going to discover whether that's the right person or maybe there's some kind of red flag we didn't pick up on because we're too busy selling the position.
Mhm, mhm. No, and I think again, we'll talk about how that leads into actually making the decision. We had a question pop up about the difference between tasks and actions. And I think that is subtle. And, again, it's a framework to help us talk through or think through it. But if I think about a situation, tell me about that time where the deal was going off track. What tasks were you responsible for? So that's really, I think about what was the thing that you were supposed to do? That's the task. Now, what actions did you take? So I was supposed to advance this deal, and I put the proposal together, and I was supposed to present and win. The actions I took when it got off track were I had to go research the competitor. I had to call our customer coach and learn more about that. I had to revise our proposal. So those were the actions that I had to take as a result of this situation. So hopefully that helps clarify. But yeah, it's interesting to think through that progression and ultimately then what came out of it and what did you learn?
Yeah, another way to think about it also is sometimes then you're asking a salesperson or someone, a candidate interviewing about a task, may give you something that's very general that applied to, something that their team did or the organization did, which is fine. But you want to make sure that they what specific actions they took personally. So particularly if they provide you with a task that was general in nature, you want to make sure that they were actually involved. They weren't just kind of taking credit for something that the team did, but what specific actions were they involved in?
That's a great clarification and good question. I appreciate that. So, when we think about, and as Norman mentioned, we have a library of these star questions. So we always provide that as part of practicing and training. Here are some examples. Let's role play. Let's get very comfortable, and then make it your own, right? So I think everybody should have their own favorites they go to, and they can dig into that a little bit further because there may be something in their resume, there may be something that they bring up during the call that says, "Oh, I want to probe further." Great, tell me about that situation, et cetera. So you really want to go in with 3 or 4 good questions in mind based on your review of their resume, and then dig in further. And I don't think you should have a dozen of these questions, right? Because each of these could end up being 5 or 10 minutes if you're really probing, if you're really getting into that story, if you're really trying to understand. So you're doing a deep dive around some of these specific actions. So let's look at how that pulls together. When we think about, we defined our star profile, right? We looked at the education, the work experience, the performance that we were looking for, the skills and knowledge that are going to be required, and those personal qualities and attributes that we defined as most important. And what's really interesting when we put this literally onto a matrix or into a spreadsheet, and we start looking and comparing candidates, it becomes much more obvious, to me at least in my experience and with our clients, that now we can start weighing, oh yeah, that person was head and shoulders above another person, based on their performance or based on how they answer the questions about their personal qualities. I think in absence of that, and I always think back to my consulting days. We were doing a lot of hiring, a very large organization, and you sit in the room or be on the conference call at the end of the day, and you say, okay, what did you like about Joe or Jill? Oh, well, I liked them. I thought they were good. And without some metric or some way to drive that, it just became opinions. And we know that in absence of that, we end up hiring people that probably look like ourselves or look like the last good person, and that may or may not be the best profile for what the organization needs. So this isn't magic, right? It isn't science in terms of it's going to spit out a score that's going to make the decision for you, but it really gives you a good idea of relative weighting and how people kind of bubble up at the end of the day.
Yeah, a couple of additional thoughts, which that, one of the things is something like this allows itself to custom tailoring. So you can actually focus in only on the skills or knowledge that you think are most relevant. You can add or subtract from a list. You can add, focus on the personal qualities. But as Ray mentioned, let's say I'm a hiring manager. Maybe I want my boss to talk to this person, maybe one of my peers. So let's just say there's 3 of us. At least we have a common framework for a debrief. So we have kind of the scoring. We're able to talk about if we saw differences, we're able to explore what those differences were. If there's commonality, we're able to explore this commonality. So we can take some of the emotion. So obviously hiring, there is an emotional aspect to it. Did the person make a good connection with us? But by simply being able to go in and decision matrix, I think we have a kind of scale of 1 to 5, total up the points, does that always mean we're going to hire the person with the most points? Probably not. But does allow us, when we have 2 or 3 people interviewing, to really assess, of the people we interviewed with, who are our top 1 or 2 people that we're zeroing in on, and let us really have an in-depth conversation, kind of build consensus around that person.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it should be emphasized that this is a worksheet, right? This is a working tool. And in fact, we'll probably end up, tossing this or deleting it. It's not like this becomes a formal evaluation or we've taken them through an assessment, but it's to help the hiring manager or managers, capture feedback and provide that input. So obviously that'll differ by HR and recruiting and by the organization, but it gives us a really nice way to compare those candidates.
So Ray, we've hired, we've hired someone, we've zeroed in on the person, but the process doesn't end there. That's just when the person gets on board. And what we found is that the number one skill, particularly for a new hire, is really around coaching. And so if we bring someone into our organization and we don't have the coaching and the mentoring associated with that to make that person successful, we're really, first of all, the probability of success goes down. But if the person has a lot of perseverance and grit, they might still be successful, but the ramp up time will go up. So we want to have the fastest ramp up time possible. And we did a study, Ray's bringing up a study that we did with Selling Power. If anyone's interested, they can, follow up with Alonzo. We'd be happy to send you a copy of the study. But it really showed the attributes of great sales managers. It was a study that focused on what are the highest performing sales organizations, what do their managers do different and better than everyone else. And you'll see it was the training and the hiring, number 3, and number 1 was coaching. So for us, for sales managers, sales coaching is our number 1. Our high impact sales coaching is our most popular program, but I think it's for good reason. It's because coaching, whether it's our program or anyone else's program, is the number 1 action a manager can take to really improve selling skills and improve sales results.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at that frontline manager's role, because it's not enough to say, okay, recruiting got us a great candidate, or maybe even, there's an onboarding process that, takes them through orientation and kind of gets them set up and ready to go. Well, really, it starts there, and it probably starts earlier than that for the manager, but it really then depends on, well, what does that first 90, 180 days look like? Are we enabling them? Are we helping make them successful? And I think the manager really needs to own that and be responsible throughout. So, we think of sales coaching as developing those skills, the knowledge and strategies to improve results. And there's no more important time than, from day one to start having those conversations. I think sales coaching often is defined as, oh, that's deal coaching. We're going to help them win deals when we come in and coach them to get it over the finish line. But this is really about coaching those key skills that they need to be successful and building a coaching plan with that individual and, carrying that through, because everybody should have a couple of things they're working on to improve their game. Even like star athletes always know 2 or 3 things that are going to make the best, the most difference in their performance. So we really want to focus in on that. We have a tool that we introduce, and I think it's a great time to have that conversation initially, which is, what are the skills that are important? So again, this is something that can be tailored, but from prospecting and booking the first meeting through closing that deal, what are all the things that we need from the sales professional to be successful? They've got to be able to build relationships and rapport. They've got to do their research and call planning and have a specific objective for each sales call. They really need to ask questions, be curious, as a number of you said, and develop the needs of the customer. So beyond just the stated need, really understand what's going on before they present their solution and handle feedback and objections, maybe negotiate and close. So it really maps, but at a very high level. This isn't meant to be a performance review, but this is meant to say, well, for that individual, let's understand where they're starting from and what their skills are. Now let's build a plan to help them with those initial skills they need to be successful. And for a new hire, that may just be about booking meetings and building relationships to start with, because they don't have a pipeline to close deals. And that's great, but let's at least understand what that is. What's their proficiency? Are they motivated to use those skills? And kind of where do they fall on that spectrum? So once we've gone through that exercise, and I'll just share briefly this development matrix, but this is a helpful tool if we think about those 8 key areas that we could plot on here and say, somebody may be very motivated, a new person, uh, to make cold calls and prospect, but they're not very good at it. They don't have the proficiency. So they'd be in the upper left there, and they probably need training and then coaching to be successful versus your more seasoned or senior experienced rep may have done that before. That they're good at actually delivering that value proposition, but they're not making an effort, right? They're not picking up the phone, they're not making the calls, they're not doing the activity levels. Well, that person probably down in the lower right needs more performance counseling, so they know how to do it, but they're not making an effort. And those are kind of different conversations. So we should really understand where the individual and those skills lie and build our coaching plan accordingly. Curious what other thoughts you have on that, Norman.
Yeah, I think this is a really valuable tool. So if it's a new hire, we're really hoping that people fall either in the coaching area, so maybe they have kind of average proficiency, hopefully average or above average motivation. And you should really zero in on 2 or 3 skills that are most important for a new hire to be successful and coach those skills. Ray suggested prospecting and building relationships. I wholeheartedly agree. Those are essential if they're going to be inheriting some current customers from someone else or that are already belong to the company, maybe some call planning techniques. So each person, you really focus on not more than 2 to 3 areas that you want to coach to. But it's also okay if you find yourself in the directing area. If you find yourself in the directing area, the person's new, maybe they need to understand what the expectations are. So it's okay to direct. Certainly, it's okay to train. In large organizations, they're going to have training department. Sales training and coaching are inextricably linked. A red flag would be if you found yourself with a new person doing performance counseling. If there's already a motivation problem and they have high proficiency, that would be a red flag. You shouldn't have to counsel someone that you've just brought on board. And more than likely, unfortunately, you won't find yourself in the upper area also on empowering. Generally, when people get proficient and they have a little bit of tenure with the company, you might empower them. You may have them mentor others. You may have them present at a sales meeting. So I think for initially, Ray, what I would add to your thoughts is it's okay if you're in the directing, as long as you're directing on everything, but you have to direct on 1 or 2 things. That's okay. Training, that's fine. That's expected with someone new. Coaching, as we said, most powerful. Performance counseling to me would be a red flag. And our goal, no matter where someone is always to move them through coaching to empowerment. So eventually they master the skill, they're excited about it. And proficiency and motivation are often inextricably linked. So we quite often learn to like the things we're really good at. So as we develop our proficiency, it may also be that our motivation goes up, which again gets to that empowering section.
No, that's great. And I think it really helps the manager then build that plan and think about, the first 90, 180 days, where are we going to focus? We want to be listening in. We really want to be helping. And when we think about allocating coaching time, because this always comes up in terms of, well, where should I spend my time? I don't have enough time to coach the way it is. And we always think on the right-hand side, that idea that we don't want to forget about our top performers. So those that have high skill level, but can we actually improve their performance to even a higher level? And we know that those top performers can sometimes outperform others by 2 or 3 times. So let's make sure we're taking care of our star performers, our star players, and we also want to retain them. So we want to make sure they feel like they're really appreciated. In terms of allocating the time, those that have the medium skill level that are kind of in the 2s and 3s on our matrix there, that's probably going to give us our best return on investment for the time we spend coaching. Because if we can move the middle up, right now we're going to have them at a higher level. And the low skill level, and this may be counterintuitive, but we're not saying forget about them, but we're not going to spend a ton of time trying to coach them. They may need retraining. We may need to reset expectations. They may need performance counseling, as Norman mentioned, or frankly, they may be in the wrong role, and we should try to determine that. But we want to allocate that accordingly. Kind of think about your team as a portfolio and where are you spending your time. But to the left side of this, the new salesperson should get top priority. So if you're having to think about where you're spending your time, they need to get the benefit of the doubt. We need to make our investment in getting them ramped up and showing, and then move forward. So I think that's a really important thought, is the new salespeople should be their top priority.
And kind of a tangible example, let's say I'm a manager with a team of 8 people and I'm bringing on the ninth salesperson. So I've got a large team. Say I had 2 that are high performers, 2 that are low performers, and 4 that are in the middle. I would generally allocate my time across those 3, with those 4 middle performers getting the bulk of my time.
Mhm.
As Ray mentioned, a little bit more to the high performers, the low performers. But on top of all that, the most time would go to the new person, number 9 on my team. So just kind of way to think about it. I often think about it as a bell-shaped curve with new hires sitting up above the curve.
That's great. And yeah, we definitely want to make sure we built that into their onboarding plan and kind of thought about how that coaching is going to work. So I know we wanted to get more input from the group here. So one last chat, and then we'll spend some time on questions, but love to understand within your organizations, what the manager's role is in onboarding. So where do they come in? What's their role from the start? And how are they engaged with the new hires? Because often there is somewhat of a handoff between recruiting, and maybe there's an onboarding or HR process. The manager gets involved, but love to have you just spend a second thinking about that and get any thoughts you have on, where does the manager come in that onboarding within your organization?
So Ray, I can just share with you from, just my experience, managers' role in onboarding can vary dramatically. In smaller companies, super, super involved. In much larger companies, here we're saying, they partner with L&D and coach, give insights, assign a peer mentor. So that's a very, that's very traditional type of approach. That's great. Um, we advocate, obviously getting the manager actively involved. We've been on training programs. We like to see managers go through the training with their sales teams. It's a great way for them to really understand how proficient someone is in a skill, how motivated they are, where they have room for improvement. I'm seeing, comment here. My manager's in charge of all onboarding training, arranging to have high performers help in the training. So they're leveraging and empowering the top performers. Set the foundation, then they become more of a, kind of a foreman. Uh, Dennis is saying in our company as a manager, I do it all from recruiting to
Mhm.
onboarding and training. So again, clients have different approaches. Ray, what's been your experience?
Yeah, and I think it does vary, but I like, there certainly seems to be a theme that the manager should and are involved from the start. And sometimes they're doing the onboarding training, or if it's a large organization where that's being taken care of, at least they should be engaged. They should be following them along. They should be coaching them. So if they have an assignment in the classroom, maybe they're reviewing that, or maybe they're sending them their prospecting video, right? So they start to get a flavor, as opposed to, oh, here's the finished product, 6 weeks later, good luck. And sometimes the manager, that's the first time they've really engaged. The other thing I think is super important is the manager's role in the milestones that they need to achieve to be successfully onboarded. And what I mean by that is, we think about, okay, they need to start, they go through this process, they get their laptop, whatever, but at what point do we expect them to be on the phones or to be actually responding to leads? At what point do we expect them to be proficient at presenting the value proposition? At what point do we expect them to enter their first deal in the pipeline? Obviously, plus or minus, but when do they start building pipeline? When does their pipeline grow to an acceptable level? And I love this idea of time to first deal. So how long do we think it's going to take them to close that deal? If we put that as a stake in the ground and work backwards, obviously the environment and the pipeline is going to vary, but at least it's a good benchmark. Are they on track? And at what point are they now really at the ramp rate we need them to achieve quota? So we should work back from that so that we know if they're off track and they're not on that path. So I think the manager should be directly involved in helping to define that onboarding process and those milestones.
Ray, that comment you mentioned reminds me of something we have in our onboarding ourselves for, in our onboarding programs, which is what is the time to productivity? And so if you think about the ramp up time, kind of a rule of thumb we use is 90 days plus the sales cycle. So let's say it's a 6-month sales cycle, that is probably a 9-month ramp up. Again, if it's a year sales cycle, then it might be as much as 15 months for a full ramp up. But we're saying the thought here is ramp up is when are they going to be fully productive? So they're not going to be fully productive on the day you bring them on, particularly if they're going into a brand new territory or they have to build a customer base. But just as a rule of thumb, we like to use 90 days plus the sales cycle. Julio also has a really important point. I think one that's become increasingly important with almost all sales teams working remotely, which is the one-on-one time to review progress, and particularly with the new hires, checking in frequently, especially if they're working remotely, is going to be increasingly important. They may feel it's not the same as if they're coming into an office where they're going to be kind of have peers they could just rely on. A lot's going to have to happen through technology. So our thought on that process, and I like the thought that Julio's sharing, is really one-on-one conversations to understand how people are doing, what's going well for them, what are they finding challenging, and also just reviewing their progress against the milestones that Ray was mentioning.
No, really important points. And I think we need to be able to course correct sooner than later. And as we talked about, with as expensive as it is to end up with a bad hire or somebody who we find out isn't making it, we'd at least like to kind of come to that conclusion, give them every benefit of the doubt, give them all the coaching and support we can, but then make that decision at those milestones. So maybe that's 90 days, maybe that's 180 days, but we can't let that linger on to 18 months later. You're still wondering whether this person's a good fit. And in the meantime, they cost you $1 million worth of lost quota, lost productivity because they haven't been able to successfully close business.
So I know Alonzo has some information he'd like to share with the group. I also know that we have some time for Q&A. Let me just kind of wrap up with a couple of key takeaways. Again, we're going to provide a recording of the webinar. So define an ideal salesperson based on your top performers. As Ray mentioned, don't just look at your top 1 or 2 performers, maybe look at your top 20%, really understand what those attributes are. Based on those attributes, the other areas you're looking at, like work history, skills, and of course, at the personal attributes, you create a STAR profile, you know what you're looking for. You also can use the STAR questioning and really kind of determine if there's a person have the attributes you're looking for. Then you can leverage the decision matrix to evaluate and kind of just share your thoughts about potential hires with other people, really zero in on the right people to hire, and then actively involvement in the onboarding and coaching of new hires. So those are a few of our thoughts from today. Again, we're going to be providing a recording of the webinar. And with that, Alonzo, I think you had a couple of takeaways, and also you wanted to, I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So thank you, everyone. And Alonzo, back to you.
Thank you, Norman. So one thing I wanted to let you guys know is as we continue to work from home, keeping the sales team engaged, productive, and motivated is going to be more critical than ever. If you're considering or looking to improve sales management skills with a large cohort of sales managers, next week, we're running private demos of our high impact sales manager program, which is now available on our new collaborative learning experience CLX platform. We recommend this program to create an engaging and collaborative training experience to enable your sales managers to build, coach, and lead high-performing sales teams.